This is episode 11, Political Realism and Its Limits. In this video, I want to use a very interesting episode that's centered on the Greek island of Milos and look at what it shows us about political realism and the limits of this theory for explaining political affairs. First, I should explain briefly what I mean by the theory of political realism. Put it briefly, this theory holds that the state of play among nations is anarchic, meaning that there is no authority above nation states which can compel them to act or not to act, that there is no authority which can police the behavior of nations in the way that sovereign nations can police the behavior of individuals within them. A second linchpin of this theory is that nations have their own survival as the highest goal. Put simply, if you don't survive, you can't achieve your other goals. So existential survival is top-notch. And given the condition of anarchy among nations, nations find themselves in a state of competition with one another for power, because power is a way to ensure survival, in that the more powerful you are, the less likely you are to be destroyed, to be attacked, to be challenged in a significant way. Now, what naturally emerges among the nations is some form of balance of power politics, where nations will attempt to match their power against the power of other nations. Power is acquired in different ways, through annexing land, through building alliances, through increasing one's economy, and through increasing one's armaments, both in quantity and quality. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, for a time it was thought that this theory and this approach to international relations was going to become old-fashioned because a new order had emerged wherein globalist integration would replace competition, and some form of international agreement might serve as an authority which could compel nation-states, particularly when that international agreement was backed by the United States as the unquestioned hegemon. However, in recent times, it has begun to seem more likely that this post-Soviet state of things was merely a temporary anomaly, that the rise in relative power of nations like China and the actions of nations like Russia suggest that balance of power politics is still on the table. In fact, the Russians have now made moves against multiple countries in the interest of securing themselves and gaining power. It seems likely that theorists may have to dust off the realist theory and give it another hearing. But this realist theory does have its limitations. One limitation is that it doesn't make much account of domestic politics, which can nevertheless affect international relations. To take one dramatic example, which we find in both history and literature, at the end of Shakespeare's Henry IV, Part II, the dying King Henry tells his son, the future Henry V, to make use of foreign conflict to solve his domestic problems. Henry IV had spent much of his reign fighting civil conflicts, which arose from the fact that he himself got the throne by forcing Richard II to abdicate in his favor. Henry showed that the English throne was not divinely given or protected, but could be acquired by human power. And if it could be so, then it could also be taken away in the same way. It could be taken away from him or from his heirs by the same means. So he tells his son to giddy their minds with foreign wars, because nothing brings a people together so well as uniting against a common enemy. That's actually what Henry V did. He launched an invasion of France on a fairly slim pretext and was so successful in that war that he had far less domestic trouble than his father did. And one can see today that the Western countries are trying to drum up unity within their very fractured polities by pointing to a common enemy in Russia after their invasion of the Ukraine. Nevertheless, the realist theory does have a lot of explanatory power when it comes to understanding how and why states act. What's interesting is that this theory and its limitations was understood long ago. I'd like to take a look at an interesting episode from ancient history, which shows us something about how this theory works in the real world. The episode concerns the island of Milos, which is a modest-sized island in the Aegean Sea off the coast of mainland Greece. And this story appears most famously in the work of the Greek historian Thucydides, in his history of the Peloponnesian War, which was a conflict that took place between Athens and Sparta between 431 and 405 BC. Thucydides' history is actually an interesting counterexample to the classic saying that winners write the history books, because Thucydides was an Athenian and the Athenians lost. Nevertheless, the Spartans produced no historians, so it was left to others to write the history. Perhaps we should update that old saying to read, "Winners write the history books unless the winners have no writers." There aren't many Mongol histories either, despite their many victories. Now, the conditions of the Peloponnesian War arose in the aftermath of two attempts by the Persian Empire to invade Greece. Both of their invasions were defeated, and the second attempt in 480 to 479 BC saw the Spartans, or I'm going to call them the Lacedaemonians, because that's how they are typically styled both by themselves and by their contemporaries. They typically would refer to the whole territory that they controlled, Lacedaemon. Sparta was only the main settlement in that territory. And in battle, their troops fought under the lambda symbol, lambda being the Greek letter L, and it stood for Lacedaemon. So they didn't call themselves Spartans in the way we do. Anyway, the Lacedaemonians and the Athenians both, along with some other Greek allies, combined to repel the Persians, and they gained significantly in status by this act. The Athenians in particular emerged as a growing power in Greece, because after the conflict, they found themselves with a fairly large and competent navy and the ability to acquire tribute from the various Greek communities which were scattered about on the many islands which surround the Greek mainland. The Lacedaemonians were already an established military power, but they were strictly a land power. They didn't have much of a navy or much experience at sea to speak of, but they were almost unbeatable on land. And they viewed the rise of Athens with great suspicion. This situation is sometimes referred to as the Thucydides trap, where an established power is threatened by the growth of a rival and goes to war with that rival as a way of nipping the threat in the bud as much as possible. And it's called that because the situation is described in Thucydides' history. But in addition to these considerations of power, the Athenians and the Lacedaemonians were political rivals as well, as the Athenians were governed by a fairly radical democracy. Radical here meaning that they had an extremely open view of who could participate in political affairs, admitting almost all free men of a certain age to do so. Other democracies would place certain restrictions, such as property restrictions, on who could be involved in politics, but Athens was more radical than most. The Lacedaemonians, on the other hand, were an oligarchy. Politics in their state was governed by the few. They also had two kings, but these kings were not absolute rulers except on the battlefield during wartime. Thucydides' history describes these conditions in detail, hence the name Thucydides' trap for this situation. And war indeed does break out between the two city-states. During the war, the Lacedaemonians used their land power to destroy crops and food outside the long walls that protected the city of Athens. But the Athenians used their navy to bring in what they needed and to go out and acquire money from their silver mines or from tribute from the various Greek islanders. One of the larger islands was the Island of Milos, which was a colony of the Lacedaemonians, but not all that far away from Athens. At first, the Melians were neutral in the war, but over time they became more openly hostile to the Athenians, and the Athenians sent an invasion force to Melos to take care of this problem. What follows is a unique episode in Thucydides where speakers engage in a dialogue, which we now refer to as the Melian dialogue. It's quite famous, and quite rightly so. Most of Thucydides' work consists of descriptions of what happened, sometimes with explanations of why it happened or what was intended, and also of political speeches which are delivered to city assemblies with a goal of persuading the citizens to adopt one policy or another. So there's a certain amount of rhetoric in the speeches, where at bottom they are showing us what courses of action people were thinking about and what course of action they ended up choosing, and sometimes why. But in the Melian dialogue, this doesn't happen. Instead, we get a very succinct and excellent presentation of realist theory in action. Let's take a look at it. So when the Athenians arrive, the Melians did not bring the Athenian envoys before the people, but instead told them to state the object of their mission to the magistrates of the city and the few, meaning the oligarchy that ran the city. And upon that, the Athenian envoys spoke as follows. Athenians, since the negotiations are not to go on before the people, in order that we may not be able to speak straight on without interruption, and deceive the ears of the multitude by seductive arguments, which would pass without refutation. For we know that this is the meaning of our being brought before the few. What if you who sit there were to pursue a method more cautious still? Make no set speech yourselves, but take us up at whatever you do not like, and settle that before going any farther. And first, tell us if this proposition of ours suits you. Right away, the Athenians observe that rhetoric is of no use to them here, and they offer to drop it entirely. This whole affair is therefore set up as a behind closed doors discussion of what people really think, as opposed to what they say in public. In other words, we're going to get politics without an admixture of niceness or politeness or pretense that public statements always have. The Melians agree to this, and the Athenians continue with what may be the clearest declaration of the imperial attitude that one can find. Athenians, for ourselves, we shall not trouble you with specious pretenses, either of how we have a right to our empire because we overthrew the Mede, or are now attacking you because of wrong that you have done us, and make a long speech would not be believed. And in return, we hope that you, instead of thinking to influence us by saying that you did not join the Lacedaemonians, although they're colonists, or that you have done us no wrong, will aim at what is feasible, holding in view the real sentiments of us both, since you know, as well as we do, that right, as the world goes, is only in question between equals in power, while the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. So the Athenians are saying that between nations there is no such thing as justice. There is only the powerful and the weak. And the powerful do what they can, the weak suffer what they must. If you remember the discussion of the realist theory, that theory holds that indeed there is no justice. There is nothing above the nation state, including considerations of justice. There is only competition for power among states. And basically the Athenians are expressing this exact view of political affairs. Athenians, we will now proceed to show you that we are come here in the interest of our empire, and that we shall say what we are now going to say for the preservation of your country, as we would fain exercise that empire over you without trouble, and see you preserved for the good of us both. Melians, and how, pray, could it turn out as good for us to serve as for you to rule? Athenians, because you would have the advantage of submitting before suffering the worst, and we should gain by not destroying you. So the Athenian argument is one of practicality. If the Melians submit, they won't have to suffer the worst, and if they agree to submit, the Athenians gain by not having to go through the trouble of conquering the city. They could do it, but it would require effort which they'd rather save themselves, hence the whole reason for this discussion in the first place. Melians, so that you would not consent to our being neutral, friends instead of enemies, but allies of neither side. Athenians, no, for your hostility cannot so much hurt us as your friendship will be an argument to our subjects of our weakness, and your enmity of our power. Remember that the realist view is that nations are in a competition with one another for power, and the Athenians say they cannot afford to have the nations who pay them tribute start to think that they aren't powerful enough to take out an upstart islander city like Melos. This is made even clearer in the next sequence. Melians, is that your subjects' idea of equity, to put those who have nothing to do with you in the same category with peoples that are, most of them, your own colonists and some conquered rebels? Athenians, as far as right goes, they think one has as much of it as the other, and that if any maintain their independence, it is because they are strong, and that if we do not molest them, it is because we are afraid, so that besides extending our empire, we should gain in security by your subjection. The fact that you are islanders and weaker than others rendering it all the more important that you should not succeed in baffling the masters of the sea. Notice that the Melians try to bring up the idea of justice, equity. Is that equity, you ask? And the Athenians point out that between nations, there is no such thing. There is only the strong and the weak. They think that if they're independent, it's because they're strong. And if they're not independent, it's because they're weak. Basically, they say that's how other nations think. That's how they're going to read the situation. And basically, they can't afford to have people think they're weak by letting the Melians continue independent. The masters of the sea, of course, is the Athenians referring to themselves. So the Athenians have pointed out that they're not interested in any consideration that refers to justice or injustice. But the Melians continue. Melians, but do you consider that there is no security in the policy which we indicate? For here again, if you debar us from talking about justice and invite us to obey your interest, we must also explain ours and try to persuade you if the two happen to coincide. How can you avoid making enemies of all existing neutrals who shall look at our case and realize from it that one day or another you will attack them? And what is this but to make greater the enemies that you have already, and to force others to become so who would otherwise have never thought of it? Athenians, why, the fact is that continentals generally give us but little alarm. The liberty which they enjoy will long prevent their taking precautions against us. It is rather islanders like yourselves, outside our empire, and subjects smarting under the yoke, who would be the most likely to take a rash step and lead themselves and us into obvious danger. So it's an interesting argument that the Melians make, suggesting that the Athenians are harming their interest by attacking them as a neutral state and maybe giving incentive to other neutral states to try to team up or to join with Athens' enemies. But the Athenian response is also interesting. Their belief is that people that don't feel themselves suffering or constrained will tend to continue along as they have been without taking precaution for themselves. Now, I'm not sure that that's true, but it is true that states that think in an imperial way, strong states like Athens, will act in this way. They don't seem to care whether neutral states will combine against them. And I'll give two examples of this. One example would be the Americans in how they handle affairs or how they have handled affairs in North and South America through their history. And essentially, the Americans have been very high-handed in doing this. Their approach has been one that demonstrates that they don't care if other nations see what they do and don't like it. Their attitude is summed up in the Monroe Doctrine, which is we're not going to let outside nations have any influence in this hemisphere. This doctrine was put to the test during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it was adhered to. So America doesn't really care about that. And if you look at China's behavior now, they're extremely high-handed towards all their neighbors. They're involved with border disputes with many of their neighbors, including the Philippines and Vietnam, and yet they seem to not care about this. They don't care that they might push these more or less neutral countries towards the Americans, which they have done, but that doesn't seem to be a big concern of theirs. While it might be true what the Melians suggest, that this kind of behavior of the Athenians will make other neutral countries lean towards the Lacedaemonians, it's also true that imperial powers don't really care about that. So the Melians go on. Melians, well then, if you risk so much to retain your empire and your subjects to get rid of it, it were surely great baseness and cowardice in us who are still free not to try everything that can be tried before submitting to your yoke. Athenians, not if you were well advised, the contest not being an equal one, with honor as the prize and shame as the penalty, but a question of self-preservation and of not resisting those who are far stronger than you are. Now remember that the realist theory holds that survival is the highest goal, and must be because if you don't survive, you can't achieve your other goals. And the Athenians are essentially reminding the Melians of this. They're saying, questions of honor and shame don't apply here because this is a matter of your self-preservation. Honor and shame only apply, again, to contests between equal powers. It's not even a matter here of being shameful. The Melians have no choice but to submit. If they don't submit, they'll be destroyed. So the Athenians are telling them, attend to your highest goal, which is survival. The Melians reply, Melians, you may be sure that we are as well aware as you of the difficulty of contending against your power and fortune, unless the terms be equal. But we trust that the gods may grant us fortune as good as yours, since we are just men fighting against unjust, and that what we want in power will be made up by the alliance of the Lacedaemonians, who are bound, if only for very shame, to come to the aid of their kindred. Our confidence, therefore, after all, is not so utterly irrational. Athenians, when you speak of the favor of the gods, we may as fairly hope for that as yourselves. neither our pretensions nor our conduct being in any way contrary to what men believe of the gods, or practice among themselves. Of the gods we believe, and of men we know, that by a necessary law of their nature they rule wherever they can, and it is not as if we were the first to make this law, or to act upon it when made. We found it existing before us, and shall leave it to exist forever after us. All we do is to make use of it, knowing that you and everybody else, having the same power as we have, would do the same as we do. Thus, as far as the gods are concerned, we have no fear, and no reason to fear that we shall be at a disadvantage. But when we come to your notion about the Lacedaemonians, which leads you to believe that shame will make them help you, here we bless your simplicity, but do not envy your folly. The Lacedaemonians, when their own interests or their country's laws are in question, are the worthiest men alive. Of their conduct towards others much might be said, but no clearer idea of it could be given than by shortly saying that of all the men we know, they are the most conspicuous in considering what is agreeable, honorable, and what is expedient, just. Such a way of thinking does not promise much for the safety which you now unreasonably count upon. So the Melians made two considerations. One, that there may be something above nation states which affects their relations, and that something is the gods and fortune. They may be on our side, they say, because we are just men fighting against unjust. And the other consideration is balance of power. The Lacedaemonians will, out of shame, come to the defense of their own colony, and they're in equal power to the Athenians. And the Athenians have two separate replies to these claims. First, as to the claim that there may be something over nation states represented by gods or fortune, their response is fascinating. Basically, they say, how do we know that the gods won't be on our side? How do we know that they don't support us rather than you? Because the stories that the Greeks of this time had about the gods suggest that the behavior of the Athenians is something that they engage in themselves, the strong doing what they can. Of the gods we believe, they say, but of men we know that they will do as we do. The Athenians call it a necessary law of human nature that men act this way. Basically that it's a law, it has nothing to do with us. It was a law before us, it's a law we're using now, and it's a law that will exist forever after us, and it's the law predicted by realist theory, namely that nations will acquire power as a way of preserving themselves, and will assert that power over others where they can. So this consideration that gods are over the nations seems to have no practical impact on how states perform in the competition among themselves, whereas their power has an enormous impact. So that's an interesting consideration. And the later developments of Christianity make this consideration of whether God is over the nations something to think about, but for most practical purposes, it seems to have no effect. Nations still behave as if they were in a state of anarchy. As for the second claim, the Athenians suggest that the Lacedaemonians, and really all people, are worthy enough when their own interests are concerned, but they're willing to let other nations fall if it is expedient or agreeable to them to do so, even if it's shameful to do this. For example, once America decided that it had no interest in supporting the regime in South Vietnam, they pulled out, and eventually the regime was conquered and destroyed, and the country unified because it was both agreeable and expedient to the Americans to remove themselves from the conflict, even though it was also extremely shameful to them to do so. And you could find infinite other examples from history of precisely this behavior. The Melians are not convinced, so Thucydides describes what happens. The dialogue breaks up. The Melians fend off the Athenians for some time, and then the Athenians send a bigger force, and some treachery taking place inside the city. The Melians surrendered at discretion to the Athenians, who put to death all the grown men whom they took, and sold the women and children for slaves, and subsequently sent out 500 colonists and inhabited the place themselves. So that's the end result. Melos ceased to exist as it was, and all the Melians were either killed or sold into slavery. Their survival as a state was eradicated. If you want a view of a similar situation, take a look at the Russian invasion of Georgia in 2008, with Russia in the role of the Athenians, and the Georgians in the role of the Melians. The result was not their extermination, but it was the removal of a couple of breakaway republics into the Russian sphere of influence, and the elimination from serious consideration of bringing Georgia into NATO. The role of the Lacedaemonians in this conflict would be played by the US or NATO, as you like. But the episode of Melos in Thucydides is not the whole story. Some people probably know that Thucydides' history is incomplete because he died before the war ended. But what many may not know is that his history was completed by another great writer from Athens named Xenophon. In a work we know as Hellenica, Xenophon presents the end of the war. He begins from where Thucydides' history leaves off, and then he goes on to also relate much of what happened in Greek affairs after the end of the Peloponnesian War. What happened to the Athenians was that following a disastrous attempt to invade and conquer the island of Syracuse, the Lacedaemonians began to take the upper hand in the war, eventually developing a navy of their own to cause trouble to the Athenians. The Lacedaemonian fleet, under the command of the Admiral Lysander, embarked on a series of campaigns in the Aegean, taking various islands from the control of Athens. The Athenians eventually sent their whole fleet of 180 ships to take out the smaller Lacedaemonian fleet, chasing them to a city near the Bosphorus Strait. The Athenians set up camp at a beach at the head of the Aegospotami River, a bad location for supplies, but good for keeping an eye on what the enemy fleet was doing. For several days, the Athenian fleet would put out and offer battle, but the Lacedaemonians didn't engage. The Athenians would then return to their camp and set about retrieving supplies, especially food, for themselves. The Lacedaemonians secretly observed them doing this. Because the Athenian camp was such a poor location, they had to rage further and further away to procure their needed supplies. On the fifth day, after the Athenians returned to their camp and started foraging, the Lacedaemonian fleet fell upon their camp, finding almost all of the ships unmanned and unprotected, and they destroyed them all. Of the fleet, only 9 ships escaped. This was essentially the end of the Athenians in the war and the end of their empire, because without their fleet, they could no longer bring in food to Athens. One of the ships which escaped the destruction returned to Athens with news of the disaster, and Xenophon relates what happened in Book 2, Chapter 2. It was at night when the Paralis arrived at Athens with tidings of the disaster, and a sound of wailing ran from Piraeus through the long walls to the city, one man passing on the news to another. And during that night no one slept, all mourning, not for the lost alone, but far more for their own selves, thinking that they would suffer such treatment as they had visited upon the Melians, colonists of the Lacedaemonians, after reducing them by siege, and upon the Histians, and the Seonians, and the Tauronaeans, and the Aeginetans, and many other Greek peoples. I find it interesting that Xenophon directly references the episode at Melos here. In my opinion, the strongest argument that Melians had offered to the Athenians was that their injustice toward Melos would unite other groups against them. But while I find this the strongest argument, I also, as I said before, believe that it carries no weight with hegemonic powers. But while hegemonic nations, or nations striving to become so, do not feel themselves constrained by considering the justice or injustice of their actions, Xenophon's story suggests that it may be a consideration that does play a role from time to time in political affairs. What his story brings to mind is that reputation plays a role in how states are perceived and treated by others in the balance of power. So treating others with great injustice can lead to problems for yourself later. It's worth bringing a couple of examples to mind to illustrate how such considerations can come into play outside of mere competition for security predicted by realist theory. One example comes from the Aztecs during the Spanish conquest of Mexico under Cortés. The Spanish had technological superiority, it's true, but they also had extremely low numbers and poor supplies, given the extreme distance they were located from, not only from Spain, but also from any of Spain's operating bases in the New World. Their technological superiority need not have been decisive in this conflict, but the Spanish had a lot of help in their conquest. Specifically, they had tens of thousands of allied troops supplied by tribes who surrounded the Aztecs. Because the Aztecs had dominated over these tribes, in fact, farming some of them for human sacrificial victims over the years. The hatred of the Aztecs among those tribes was quite high. And when the Spanish arrived, despite the enormous ethnic, cultural, linguistic, and religious differences between the Spanish and the native tribes threw in with the foreigner as a way of getting over against their enemies, the Aztecs. The opportunity to strike a decisive blow against their hated adversary was such that the tribes took that chance. In modern times, one can see a hostility toward the Russian regimes from countries which one might otherwise see as more aligned with them, such as Poland or Hungary. Although those countries are probably more sympathetic with Russia's version of conservatism than they are with Western-style liberalism, there is nevertheless a hostility toward Russia in those two countries, dating from the very high-handed treatment given them during the Soviet era. Now, I'm aware that there's also bad blood that predates this, but the Soviet era is something in living memory and of great moment. So while it is true that powerful nations can and do act as they will on the world stage, human beings have some consideration for justice, but especially considerations for injustice, and particularly injustices against them. And when it comes to opportunities of vengeance, human beings will behave in irrational ways, and so will nation states. So an opportunity to avenge a past injustice can lead nations to make decisions which might seem contrary to what's rational or what's expected. So, while there is indeed nothing over nation states which constrains their actions, there are factors in the competition among states which stem from other considerations. One consideration is domestic politics, and I mentioned that exception earlier, but another exception would be reputation, justice, and especially injustice. The Athenians were rightly concerned for themselves after the destruction of their fleet, because several of Lacedaemon's allies wanted to visit the same treatment onto the Athenians that they had given to the Melians. But here, as Thucydides says several times in his history, the Athenians were fortunate in their choice of enemy, because the Lacedaemonians overruled their allies, and instead they gave peace to the Athenians in exchange for destroying their city walls and replacing their democracy with an oligarchy sympathetic to their own form of government.